Hello, everyone, and this is Tara Seals, Senior Editor at Threatpost, and I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today for our webinar, 5G, the Olympics, and Next Generation Security Challenges. Today we are going to be hearing from a couple of experts in the arena, Russ Mohr, who is an engineer and Apple Evangelist at MobileIron, and also Jerry Ray, who is a COO at SecureAge, and he is actually he works in Tokyo quite a bit, so he will have some feet on the ground information for us, which is great. I'd like to run through a couple of housekeeping notes before we kick it off. First of all, I'd like to point everybody to the question widget on the right-hand side of your screen. If you look, there are a few different arrows, and if you click on them, you get a drop-down box. One of those is for submitting questions for our Q&A. So these two guys are going to run through some information for us, and then we'll have a audience Q&A at the end. And you can submit those questions anytime during the presentation. Also, I'd like to note that the webinar is being recorded, so we'll be sending out a link, and you can listen on demand to that, send it to your colleagues, et cetera, and we highly encourage that, of course. Okay, and just a note about our agenda. Clearly, we're the hook here is that we're going to use the Tokyo Summer Games as a jumping off point to discuss the possibilities that are possible with 5G technology rolling out, and clearly, it's an enormous test bed. There's been a lot of innovation going on, ramping up to the event. Clearly, with the coronavirus pandemic, there are concerns about whether or not the Olympics will go on as scheduled. They might be postponed, possibly even as long as a year or two. We're just not sure. Right now, the IOC and the Japanese government are both saying that the show will go on. But that, of course, remains to be seen, so fingers crossed. But nonetheless, we think that regardless of cancellation or not, this is going to be a very interesting discussion because, again, what they're doing in advanced preparation for the Olympics is absolutely amazing from a technological standpoint, and some of the innovation that we're seeing coming out with 5G use cases. And obviously, that brings along a lot of security concerns. So we're going to talk about some of those, and we're going to bring this back where it's applicable to you guys in the audience and to your businesses, and talk a little bit about what the security concerns from a macro perspective are and how they relate to your businesses, and also provide some takeaways and best practices for how you can secure 5G strategies as we go forward. And with that, I am going to pass the ball over here to our first presenter, who is Russ Mohr with MobileIron. And Russ, welcome to our webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tara. Appreciate the intro. Let me just minimize this, and we'll get sharing. So, Threatpost, thanks so much for having myself and Jerry Ray here today. We're really excited to talk to you about the upcoming Tokyo 2020 Olympics. And as always, you can reach me at RH-Mohr on Twitter, RHMOHR. I do tweet a lot, especially about 5G and security these days. So Tokyo Olympics, really something to look forward to. If they do happen, as Tara mentioned, there is some risk right now. But we should see around 11,000 athletes there. Looks like there's almost 8 million tickets that are going to be sold for this event. And there'll be 33 different sports in Tokyo. But that's not what interests us today. We want to talk a little bit about the technology we're going to see. And to start off, this is a Toyota self-driving car. And we're going to be seeing a lot of this at the Olympic Games. And this one might actually be used to escort an athlete or a staff member onto the field. I think this only actually holds 1 or 2 people in it. But that's not the only autonomous driving that we're going to be seeing at the Games. We're going to be moving people around in autonomous vehicles. So obviously, these are going to need connectivity. They are not going to be able to connect to Wi-Fi networks. We're going to be leveraging 5G networks built primarily by NTT Docomo for the Games. also some 5G from another carrier called Rakuten. And Toyota is going to be partnering. This particular vehicle, I think, can move around 12 people at once or so. But the real prize of the show, if we see this, and this is still rumored, is Toyota is going to show their flying car at the game. So codename Morizo, announced as far back as 2017. But we're really hoping that we would be able to see an autonomous flying vehicle at the 2020 Olympics. So lots of different applications for 5G technology. Some of them include big investments from companies like NEC, Panasonic, and others. And in this particular case, we are seeing facial recognition. So at these events, I mentioned there's 11,000 athletes, but with all the staff and all the tertiary requirements for people moving in and out of the stadiums, they expect to have 300,000 authorized personnel working at the Olympics. And so we're still going to have the lanyard that this young lady is holding in her hand, but we're also going to have an additional security mechanism, which is facial recognition. So these are going to be all over the place, spread throughout Tokyo at the different venues, and they're going to be amassing a lot of personally identifiable information about these people. So at least a data set of 300,000 records of personal information that are now presumably going to be stored somewhere in the cloud. So we'll have additional security, but we'll also be creating some new honeypots of highly secure information at these games. Another thing that we're definitely going to see is a lot of augmented reality, virtual reality, and especially we're going to see mixed reality. And one of those technologies for mixed reality is going to be called 3DAT, 3D athlete tracking, and another one is actually the virtual arena. So a virtual arena is also sometimes referred to as a digital twin. And what they're actually able to do is make an exact copy of an arena where an event is going to take place, and then have staff or even athletes walk through that arena, interact with that arena, make plans about where they're going to be, what the best viewing point is in that arena. And that's going to require lots of edge compute power to do that, to show those graphics in real time, but also it's going to require very low latency. You're going to be able to need to react in real time with that stadium. The other thing I mentioned is 3DAT, and I actually want to show you what this looks like. So this is 3D athlete tracking in action. So what we can see over here is we have 3 leaders in this race clearly, and we are able to actually track them, and we're actually be able to point at who the winners are. And that's even in advance of the Olympic official saying these were the winners. We at home, using the 3DAT technology, will be able to track, where a swimmer is in a race, where a runner is in a race. And often these races are won within just a few milliseconds. And that's going to be really important. And that's one of the main things that 5G brings to us. Ultra reliable, low latency connections that allow us to have as low as 1 millisecond of latency. So another reason why 5G is going to be very important for these games. And of course, a lot of this stuff, a lot of these events are going to be transmitted in 8K digital video this year. So that's also going to require a lot of bandwidth and a lot of low latency connections. So what you see here actually is an image from Pyeongchang a few years back when we had the Winter Olympics. And what you're looking at, that Olympic logo, is actually drones. And drones are going to play a very big part in this game. So Panasonic will be offering technology around crowd control. NEC will also be in the mix. And they'll also be monitoring the crowds. So is there suspicious activity happening in that crowd? They'll also be broadcasting video from these drones. So drones are going to have a very big role in the 2020 Japan Olympics. But at the same time, we also need to protect our drones and protect the attendees and the athletes at these events. So it's a safe assumption that there will not only be friendly drones, collecting information and broadcasting events, but there will also be another kind of drone that's able to take out a rogue drone, for example. So we should expect that both of those will be present at the 2020 games. And of course, drones need very low latency communications. They need to react very quickly. That's something 5G gives us. And boy, I couldn't complete this this presentation about technology we're going to see at the 2020 games without showing you guys some cute robots. So these robots are going to help visitors. So we should expect to see them in the airports, in the subways. They can give you directions in multiple languages. And at the same time, they can also scan the crowds for suspicious activities. So they'll have more than one role. And we are expecting to see quite a few of these robots deployed for the 2020 games. So now that I talked to you about some of the technology that we're expecting the Olympics to unlock, how does that relate to 5G? What are the technologies that are specifically relevant to what we've been talking about? First off, I'd just like to level set and let you know that 5G is an order of magnitude faster than 4G. So up to 10 gigabits down, and using some multiplexing technologies, even up to 20 gigabits downstream speed. And there's two specific technologies I'd like to call out that will be really important. Enhanced mobile broadband isn't on this slide, but that's actually what consumers will see on their devices. So on the Samsung phones, on the Huawei phones that already have 5G chipsets, on the iPhone that's going to be announced in the fall, we're expecting to have a 5G chipset on that device as well. So those speeds won't be quite as high as the 20 gigs down. They'll be a little slower. And as we roll out over the years, we'll see speeds increase. But the really important technologies that are part of the 5G spec put out by the 3GPP are MMTC, which is massive machine type communications. That just means that we can have an extremely high density of devices riding on a 5G network. Many more devices than we can have on a 4G network, for example. And URLLC, I already talked about this. This is the high frequency, low delay part of 5G. So this is the spectrum that allows us to actually hit the sub 1 millimeter bandwidth delay. Another piece of technology that we're going to see carved out in the 2020 Olympics is the radio access network, commonly referred to as network slicing. Many of the carriers have offerings around this already. And this is where you can actually provision a private 5G network with quality of service. So you could say, look, those robots, they only need 30 millisecond delay. I will configure a network slice for them. But those drones are going to need 2 milliseconds of delay. They need to react quickly. So I'm going to create another network that has that quality of service on it, and that is leveraging URLLC, ultra reliable, low latency communications. And finally, another technology we're going to see that's going to be very important in the games is MEC. So multi-access edge computing. We've seen a lot of partnerships with Intel at the games around this, and this is really just compute power. This is the idea of bringing the application closer to the application server. So when we're running a drone network, when we're running autonomous vehicles, they might need to communicate more quickly with a server. So even if you have it in AWS, it might be somewhere, in the very core of that network. So we want to get to the edge of the network. We want to have the compute power as close to the end devices as we can, and that's what MEC is all about. And I'm sure you'll be reading a lot of announcements around partnerships around MEC over the coming years. So now that we talked about what are the applications and what's the technology enabling them, let's just talk quickly about what the risks are. So there are a few risks with 5G. Number one is we have protocol vulnerabilities. We had some announced at Black Hat last year. We had some researchers from Purdue and the University of Iowa build a tool called the 5G Reasoner that found 5G networks in theory were susceptible to all sorts of attacks, including man-in-the-middle, replay attacks that run up your phone bill, and actually hijacking of the paging channel. So in the US, we would call this an Amber Alert. So you could broadcast your own Amber Alert. So there are some vulnerabilities that need to be addressed by the 3GPP governing body. The good news is 5G is the most secure wireless cellular protocol to date. However, it takes some time to roll out, and it takes some time to go live in networks around the world, especially when a new revision is released. Another risk is 4G interdependence. So we're not going to see standalone 5G everywhere in 2020. And as a matter of fact, it's probably going to be closer to 2025 when we see pure 5G networks. That means that we will sometimes fall back to 4G or even slower technologies when 5G is not present, or when we move away from a 5G small cell or cell tower. Other risks are supply chain trust. This one has been in the news a lot. So in Japan, I believe that they don't trust Huawei at all. They don't have Huawei in their networks, at least in the 5G portion, for KDDI, Docomo, Rakuten, and SoftBank. But in other countries, we do have this issue where there may be a company that we don't trust in the network. In particular, Huawei has been accused of leveraging the lawful intercept interface, which is what a law enforcement agency would use to tap into. In the US, they would require a warrant to do this, but they could do things like get call detail records, see when and where a call was placed, or even listen into a phone call. So there have been some accusations against Huawei in China. So we're not sure we can trust every network in every country. And just the pure density of it. So 5G uses small cells. Small cells are about the size of a shoebox. So there'll be a lot of them out there. And just the fact that there's going to be so much of this, it's going to be a little bit easier for hackers to hide in plain sight. There's off-the-shelf technology that they can buy called stingrays, or also referred to as dirt boxes, or IMSI catchers that can grab information about your device, including location sometimes, and be used to launch exploits. And finally, we're going to see user behavior change a lot. So, hey, if you are an employee walking into your company and you have a much faster network that you're already connected to on 5G, and the applications that you're using are cloud applications like Office 365 or Slack or Workday, you might not ever actually connect to a network that sits behind the firewall that your company can control. So we're going to see user behavior change. There'll be less connecting to Wi-Fi. So what can we do to address some of that? And one of the things I love to talk about is the zero trust model. This was first coined by an analyst named John Kinderberg back in 2010. And the essential principle of zero trust is we actually never trust and we always verify. So we actually have to assume that because of all those vulnerabilities and risks I just showed around 5G, that we might not actually be able to trust that network. So what are some of the technologies we need to consider that are going to help us mitigate risk in a 5G world? And that might help the Japan Olympic Committee mitigate trust. So by the way, there's going to be a bunch of new sports in the 2020 Olympics, and one of them is skateboarding, which is going to be super fun to watch. But also on this slide are some of the things we need to consider when it comes to building zero trust defense for 5G. So one of them is a lot of the primary devices connecting to them, and a lot of the data is going to reside on devices like iOS and Android, maybe Windows 10 and Mac OS as well, when they have 5G chips. So we need to make sure that we can trust the device. And then almost all of the things I showed you before were IoT applications, Internet of Things. So we need to consider how are we going to analyze data from lots of different types of devices that are running different operating systems, and we don't really have a way to control them. So we might need to think about agentless IoT. How can we take data from hundreds of thousands or millions or tens of billions of devices and analyze that data in the cloud using AI to look for anomalies? Another thing we should really consider is conditional access. So once we decide whether we trust the IoT device or the iPhone or Android device, we need to decide if we trust you, are we going to allow you into the network? Or if we don't trust you, maybe you can't have access to the 300,000 facial recognition imprints that I'm storing up in the cloud. So conditional access, we need to be able to make a decision about that. Network segmentation is very important. So once you get access to a network that sits beyond 5G, like a corporate network or an internal Olympic network, we need to make sure that you actually can't get very far once you're in there. And then basic security sanity, we need to have encryption. We need to encrypt those 300,000 data records of athlete identity and staff identity. And we also need to encrypt it in transit. So leveraging SSL, leveraging off-the-shelf VPN technology would be really important. And then lastly, I think we need to decide who has access to that data, where is that data going to be stored, most likely in the cloud. So we need to really think about how we do role-based access control to sensitive data that sits in the cloud. So those are some of the things that I think we should be thinking about for 5G that I think the Olympic Committee should be thinking about. And with that, I would like to pass it off to Jerry Ray to continue with the presentation.
Thank you so much, Russ. That was outstanding. And thanks, Tara, for giving me the opportunity to be here.
Do you have the ball? I passed you the ball yet?
Not yet, but I'm sure it'll be here any moment now.
It probably will as soon as I can get this screen to come up again. So, I found it. Here you go, Jerry. It's on the way.
Thank you very much, Russ. And thank you for that lead in as well. You ended with a comment about encrypting the data. And that's my background and somewhat my purpose, and really where the focus of the work I do here for the government and military of Singapore and government of Japan is focused on, is just securing that data. And with that in mind, for all the listeners, where Russ's was just tremendously visual and showing all the exciting things that 5G is bringing to life at the Olympics, mine is precisely the opposite. It's dealing with that data on the backside, the things that can't be seen, the massive troves of generated data that are going to come about from each one of those devices. And with that, don't expect too much visually here. I'll be talking a bit about what it is to secure this data and what type of mindset it took for Japan to put things in place to secure the data. I mean, the challenges that 5G bring about are ones that are perfectly attuned to Japan's vision for the Society 5.0. They want to bring together this mesh of technology and devices, not just the standalone information of Society 4.0, but in 5.0, make sure these devices, these IoT pieces are everywhere and they're accessible. And it's 5G that's making that possible. But to get there has not been an easy battle for Japan. I mean, cybersecurity there has had a number of issues for quite some time, and the Olympics were just the perfect mechanism to launch them into a new era of that. So just as 5G is coming about for mobility, the Olympics themselves are bringing Japan to a new era in security mindset. So I'm going to focus a bit on that as we move on and talk some more about encryption as well. So, I mean, forgive the bullet points here, but Japan is just like any other place, and many of the issues it was facing leading up to the Olympics now and before are ones that everyone else is seeing, that, you know, technology is just rapidly increasing and overwhelming us, and security rarely gets the attention it needs. It's kind of the back end piece that was thought of after all the exciting pieces, such that Russ showed us visually, were built and configured. At the very end, we're going to throw some security on. I mean, as well, what do we buy? What do we use? There's so many claims in so many categories, whether it's, you know, EDR, EDP, it's just, which is the right tool to protect this particular piece of data? Data at rest, data in motion, the streaming data that's going to be coming from the tools and the products that we're going to see at the Olympics are going to make those questions even more complex. You know, well, how do we secure the facilities gates? How do we secure the filmography from the drones? What about the facial recognition systems? And what about the pure data that's up in the air that's allowing all the communications to take place in these massive, massive pipelines of streaming data? You know, we're also seeing that, you know, cyber criminals and nation states, they get a much bigger bang for their money when they want to attack things. And the Olympics is the high profile moment in any country's existence. And it's also the perfect time to put a black eye in it. And we saw that somewhat in Pyeongchang 2 years ago, a cyber attack right on the outset. We saw it in Brazil 2 years before that. You know, it's very easy for people to come up with low cost ways, low barrier ways to do something to just make things go awry, embarrass the host as much as they can. You know, we've also seen a long history of security tools that were just simply ineffective. Despite the growing number of tools that are out there for people to protect themselves, the number of breaches are expanding even more quickly than those. I mean, so Japan has to deal with all of these. It's got Olympics to organize, but on top of that, it's got its own history that it has to deal with. I mean, for quite some time, they've been lagging in legislation. They just haven't had mandates there for things like disclosing cyber attacks or data breaches to the citizenry. They've got inherently a tremendous level of trust and reliance on systems. Whether these systems are social or technical, Japan believes that they simply work. And when you've got people who are intentionally trying to undermine these systems, and again, referring back to the nation states or motivated hackers, it's hard to envision that these systems are ones that people would actively try to tear down when they were so thoughtfully put up in the first place. You know, there's also some issues with leadership in Japan. And not that leadership is poor, it's just the way they put people in leadership positions to make these cybersecurity decisions. You know, Japan is quite famous for having rotating jobs within companies, and this expands onto the government as well, 2-year rotations, 3-year rotations. And these rotations don't necessarily follow expertise or education. As people are moving forward in their career, they can take on a variety of different jobs and get training, very relevant and solid training within their companies, but not quite enough that would allow them to spearhead something as significant as cybersecurity. So with these Japan-specific cyber challenges, it's really something that they were able to recognize this, use the Olympics and the rollout of 5G as the impetus to make it all better. And they've really done a great thing in putting things in line, having run through a great number of iterations of trials since 2014, you know, hoping they would get the games. And once it was announced, they immediately got busy, knowing that the Olympics is that spectacle, you know, the equivalent to the World's Fair to show who you are. Tokyo hasn't had this opportunity since 1964, and they wanted to make the most of it. but it was just brilliant that they did what they did in terms of security. They enacted some new legislation, and they have this IoT Cybersecurity Action Program that they put into place in 2017, and IoT is one of the biggest concerns for them. So they even took it upon themselves in 2019 to create a mandate to attack IoT devices of the citizens of Japan. Whether the whole citizenry knew it or not, these attacks were undertaken, and Japan learned a great deal about the vulnerability of most types of IoT devices and what they should be putting in place to protect the ones that will be either running the games or protecting the critical infrastructure of Japan throughout the period of the games and thereafter. Japan's also allocated a great deal of funding from the government to allow these advances in security to take place. They set up a national cyber training center. They increase cybersecurity drills from 6 to 10 times a year. They've also made an effort to put government and private industry together to create these entities such as the Cybersecurity Factory, which is a collaboration between NEC and the government. And finally, they've invested heavily in training at the university level and on through companies and other entities. It's really something that Japan was able to put together in a way that, spending most of my adult life in Tokyo, seeing that only Japan can. It's highly organized. When it puts its mind to any task, it does it extraordinarily well. And again, I pointed just a few moments ago about IoT and critical infrastructure being those two target areas that Japan is worried about most. And it's 5G that's making this all come about. 5G is bringing IoT devices to life in a way they haven't been. Critical infrastructure relying on sensors and other tools that can be connected rapidly and at greater distances via 5G. This is another vulnerability that's being posed. So most of what Japan's done in those funding, those entities, the training, it's all going to protect IoT and critical infrastructure. And in the ways it's protecting it, my particular focus and interest will always be on the actual data itself, because all of these devices, everything in critical infrastructure is generating data that is now giving us a nonstop tap. Everything is going to constantly be in motion. Everything's going to be increasing. The data sets we have will be more complex, but also more rich, and the things we can do with them will only be meaningful if we can protect that data. The other piece that's going to come up within IoT and critical infrastructure protection is AI itself. There's going to be a great deal of reliance on what AI can do, and Russ mentioned it a bit ago in terms of sifting through the data sets, but also protecting it, recognizing threats, doing things that couldn't be done from any manual attempts at humans, regardless of their level of expertise, just by the mass exposure that AI will have to different threat vectors and actions by nation states and otherwise. The real catch here on the AI portion is that it takes training and it takes time. The amount of time, the amount of opportunities for training for AI that are going to be involved with IoT and critical infrastructure are places where I worry a bit that nothing's yet going to be really robust enough to handle some of the security issues that are going to come up within just a couple of months, if indeed the Olympics happen in a couple of months. But that's something that I think everyone will face, whether it's an Olympic bound issue or not. And that kind of brings me back to what I was speaking a bit ago about how product and tools are going to be something that Japan and every other country is going to struggle with as they look to secure these 5G networks. How can you have tools that are going to be secure that without really limiting all the advances and the engagement that viewers can have when enjoying these advanced augmented reality and virtual reality opportunities from 5G. Also, the straightforward implementation. These are complex. 5G is going to just multiply the complexity of things, particularly as various IoT devices come on, each with their own operating system, each with their own security protocol as standards still haven't come about at that point. And then finally, regulatory compliance is something that has to be considered, and tools have to be available simply for covering all the different regulations that address either particular populations or particular pieces of data. GDPR from the EU, we've got to consider the EU residents who will have any interactivity here at the Olympics and beyond. So it's quite a challenge. Japan has taken tremendous strides, and it's this unique combination of both the Olympics and this opportunity for 5G to finally be ready, coming together, that give them an opportunity to really take a lead now in security in a way they hadn't in the past. So with that, I'd like to open it up to different questions, hopefully more for Russ, and have Tara join in.
Great, thank you, Jerry. Let me just okay, yes. So we can move to our Q&A session. I'd like to thank both of you for those two absolutely fascinating presentations. Lots of great content in there for sure. But lots of room to talk about other things as well. I would also like to invite the attendees again to submit your questions. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should be able to see a widget. There's a drop-down menu there that says questions, and you can submit through there. So let me ask, from just a purely real-world standpoint, if I'm a US-based business, what are some of the initial 5G use cases that I might want to implement within my corporate world that will change the game for security? Russ, maybe you can take a stab at that.
Yeah. So is the question from like the standpoint of a business or the standpoint of like just a consumer?
From a business, so from a business standpoint, corporations and even SMBs, I would think we'll find rich grounds for making use of some of the step changes in 5G that we're going to see, right?
Yeah, well, they absolutely will. So let me speak from, by the way, I'm located in New York in the US, and I work with carriers quite a bit in my day-to-day transactions. So I'm seeing a big push from, especially in the US, from Verizon and AT&T around selling 5G services to the enterprise, and the main thing that they are pushing is last mile backhaul. So a lot of them invested a lot of money putting fiber in the ground, which has a very long return. It takes a long time to get that money back. So just backhaul services over 5G networks that are much faster than what they've been doing traditionally and much cheaper for them. And then the other thing that we talked about was network slicing. And we especially see a lot of this like in manufacturing, like you have an autonomously guided vehicle, an AGV, like let's say you're Ford Motor Company, and you've got a factory and an assembly line, and you've got a forklift that needs to be able to stop in 20 or 30 milliseconds. Then 5G is a really good fit for you, especially on an ultra reliable, low latency private 5G network, because you have that low latency and you're able to make decisions quickly enough so that somebody doesn't get hurt. Also, like, in the enterprise, like take car manufacturing still, like if you had an assembly line and you wanted to analyze data very quickly to see if something was going to break soon on that assembly line and stop it before you had to shut down for a day, then that would also be really interesting for you. And you might combine it with MEC, or you might combine it with AI in the cloud. So those are two really big use cases that I see for it in the enterprise. And I also think that the enterprise networks are going to change. I mean, the whole traditional boundary of the firewall, that's just not going to exist anymore because user behavior changes. So enterprise needs to think about, like, what is the security approach for that? As I mentioned, like, Gartner has something called SACE, which stands for Secure Access Service Edge. Forrester calls it Zero Trust. I really think the enterprise needs to take some time thinking about, like, shifting to that model instead of making the traditional security investments that they've been making.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, and so, you know, and a related question to that, what are some of the ways that hackers may try to penetrate someone's 5G footprint? Are there new attack vectors to be considered here, or is it just sort of more of the same IoT, you know, attack surface story that we've seen a lot of, or what's different, what's new?
So I mentioned in the presentation that, like, first of all, there's vulnerabilities. There's vulnerabilities and there's off-the-shelf equipment that allows you to exploit known vulnerabilities in the 4G network and possibly in the 5G network. And so these are IMSI catchers. Companies like Harris make them and sell them. And then, you know, there's kits that you can download off the internet that allow you to very cheaply start intercepting things like IMSIs, like your personal subscriber information, that might allow you to know location and stuff like that. So there are those are some of the attack vectors. I don't think we know all of them yet, and that's one of the things about, like, Zero Trust. Like, we just don't know yet, so we need to really look at behavior. One of the things that a hacker might do that got access to a 5G network is they might use it to implant malware on a device, right? You have this perfect spying device like an iPhone or an Android device. It's got a radio, it's got a camera, it can record, it knows your passwords. I mean, all this stuff. It's a perfect spying device, and now you've got malware on it. So you know, there are things that we can do to protect against that, like protect against behavior, like is somebody trying to get elevated access on a device. And the same goes for IoT. So we can look at data en masse and IoT and use, you know, machine learning or AI to analyze that data and look for the anomalies. So I think, you know, those are some of the vectors, but there are things, like good things that we can do about it today with technology that's available today.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. You know, Jerry, here's a question for you. And I would just like to let the audience know as well that Jerry is coming at us from Tokyo. And so it's almost 3 o'clock in the morning there. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for making yourself available for this, Jerry. So a question for you on data security. 5G, the volumes are going to be much, much higher thanks to, you know, the higher throughput and the lower latency. And so, you know, you guys had both mentioned the role of AI and kind of slicing and dicing some of the threat intel and things like that to try to make security defense a little bit more manageable. But, you know, for enterprises, what would you say would be some top best practices, just, you know, kind of broad brush for companies going forward as they embrace 5G?
Sure, that's a terrific question, one I'm pondering all the time myself too. You know, I think the good thing about the data is that, you know, it is still data, and encryption, traditional approaches to protecting the data are still in effect. If you look toward data at rest, data in motion, we're going to be looking at ultra-fast algorithms and protocols that allow us to encrypt those data streams. But traditional algorithms are still fine for those troves of data at rest. Something that is also coming about right about the same time are some post-quantum algorithms that people may want to consider. It might be the opportunity now to see how those fare with these large data sets. But as far as best practice, if I can just sum that up by saying, use encryption, find tools that offer the encryption. If we're looking at the IoT devices themselves and the threat vector on those sitting as critical infrastructure components or IoT devices in the home, smart cities, or elsewhere, I think encryption is going to be something that helps out there too, but in the form of an SSL VPN type appliance, something that is on the inside of the last point of IoT devices. So say you've got a home with refrigerator, radio, television, other monitoring devices. If there is some type of appliance, a VPN appliance there that takes the security burden away from all the IoT devices and force the attacker to just hit that VPN appliance and the encryption that's inside of there, it may be a much better approach than trying to somehow secure all the disparate operating systems and standards that exist on those individual IoT devices themselves.
Gotcha. No, that's great. Thank you. Okay, guys. Well, we're kind of getting to the end of our time here. I guess just to wrap up, do you have any last thoughts or lessons learned that we didn't talk about that you think is important when it comes to either 5G security for enterprises or when it comes to the Olympics?
For my part, I'm just hoping they happen. I think the whole planet needs some type of enjoyment and a break from this weird reality we're all facing. And on the other hand, I know that motivated hackers, nation states, hacktivists, and otherwise aren't going to let it just be a playtime for everybody. So, it's a good thing we're discussing this here, and I'm really thankful that you made this webinar happen.
Thanks so much, Russ.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts from you, Jerry, before we let everybody go?
Well, that was Jerry, but I just want to piggyback.
Sorry.
That's okay. I just want to piggyback on one thing Jerry said, and no free pass. I think that's something really important now that the world is a little bit more vulnerable. That doesn't mean the attackers are going to let up. And if anything, remote infrastructure becomes that much more critical. So a ransomware attack, when everybody is working from home and is accessing resources on a corporate network, becomes that much more crippling. So I think it's a time for increased vigilance. We may not be in our offices anymore in certain parts of the world, but we need to really stay vigilant right now because we're vulnerable, and the attackers aren't going to slow down. So Jerry, I think that was really very well said. As far as the Olympics go, I'm not sure. I'm hoping that they'll happen. I'm very excited by the innovation that they unlock. I'm very excited about 5G, and I think the need for 5G is now accelerated also with so much remote work happening. So although I'd love to have be able to watch them this summer from the comfort of my home, I think the world needs to go on timeout for a little bit right now. But like I said, we should stay very vigilant.
Great. Okay, guys. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there. I'd like to let our attendees know that if you have any questions for these guys or any feedback on our event today, please feel free to contact me. That's my email address there. And we will certainly get back to you. Jerry and Russ, thank you very much for your time. And thank you to all of our attendees who took some time to learn about the Olympics and 5G today.
Thank you, Tara.
Thank you. Thanks for staying up so late, Jerry.
My pleasure.